19. I will be reading verses 1 through 16. This is the beginning of the end, so to speak. We'll pick up with a conversation going on between Pilate and Jesus. I encourage you would to stand with me as we read. As we're reading it now, the kids are getting up. If they can be dismissed to go to their group, children's ministry group, as before we start to read God's Word. John 19, verses 1 through 16. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in purple robe. They came up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priest and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate said to him, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has made himself out to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered the headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" And Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes him a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at the place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. And now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." And they cried out, away with him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. Thank you. You may be seated.
Thank you, Charles. Good morning, people of grace. It's great to see everyone, and happy St. Patrick's Day. Some of us Protestants are a little afraid to celebrate St. Patrick's Day, but St. Patrick was a great missionary in the early days of the church before the Protestant Reformation, and he literally took the gospel to the country of Ireland and all of that about the snakes coming out and all that. That's more of a mythical part of the story, but the great part of the story is he took the gospel to Ireland and is actually a great hero of the faith that we'll meet someday in heaven. So what Charles just read for us in chapter 19, verses 1 to 16, is the last scene before the crucifixion of Jesus. This chapter contains the second half of Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate. If you were here with us last week, you might remember we began by talking about the term kangaroo court, which is a term we use for a courtroom case that is unfair or unjust. It's a court case that is a joke, but not in a funny way. As we mentioned last week, Jesus, in a period of about 12 hours, stands on trial in not just one kangaroo court, or even 3 or 4, But believe it or not, in less than a full day, he stands trial in 6 kangaroo courts. 3, as we mentioned last week, were before the Jewish leaders. 2 in the middle of the night before the high priest, and 1 in the early wee hours of the morning before the Sanhedrin, which is called together. The Sanhedrin was a gathering of 70 religious and political leaders, their version of the Supreme Court. So those were the first 3 trials, and then the final 3 trials were before the Romans. 1 before Pilate, described in chapter 18, then 1 before King Herod Antipas, which Luke tells us about. But after Antipas can't get Jesus to do any magic tricks for him or any signs, as he says, he sends him back to Pilate. And when he gets back to Pilate, it's trial number 6. All 6 of these were kangaroo courts. In fact, many biblical scholars and commentators have found 18 various laws that were broken in these court cases, including the 2 in the middle of the night, which was absolutely forbidden in the Jewish Talmud. Not having witnesses to testify in the trial, absolutely forbidden, should be thrown out. But 16 others that we won't go into. But the point of this is not incompetence on their part. The point is the wickedness of mankind. What we are reading, what Charles just read, and what we've been discussing the last few weeks is the wickedness of mankind, religious people and secular people all together. Crucify him, crucify him. They are determined to rid the world of the only innocent man who ever lived. So that's where we pick up the story. As we said last week, while Jesus is the one who is on trial, though, before Pilate, in most of chapter 18 and chapter 19 here, it becomes obvious as we dig into the story that it is Pilate, not Jesus, who is really on trial. Pilate, the Roman governor, appears strong and in control. He's a man's man. He's worked his way up to the top in Roman politics. He even married the granddaughter of Caesar Augustus. He's part of the royal family. But in this story, we see him dashing back and forth, trying to decide what to do with this mystery man. He tries to push him off on the Jewish leaders 2 or 3 times. They push him right back to Pilate. He then tries to send him to Herod, as we mentioned, who then sends him back. And finally, Pilate appeals to the crowd, as Charles read. Matthew tells us that he even washes his hands in front of everyone to declare his innocence. His guilt is overwhelming him, and he knows it. He is the one who is on trial. What will he do with this Jesus? But he's not the only one on trial. The religious leaders are as well. In fact, Jesus tells him they are more guilty and more responsible than Pilate. They are getting ready to murder the anointed one, the long-awaited Messiah. How can they be so blind? How can this happen? They are certainly on trial for their actions. And then there's the crowd. They are the ones who are partying like crowds tend to do, having a great time with all the pageantry, all the drama, in the midst of a disgusting scene. What will they do with this Jesus? Pilate gives them a vote. And what do? They vote for a terrorist named Barabbas, son of the Father, to be released instead of Jesus, the Son of the Father. John, remember, is the author of this gospel. And he is showing us all three of these groups of people and saying they are all on trial for their lives and for eternity. And they're all standing there and they're all guilty. But that's not all. We are the audience that John is writing to. We're the readers of the book. We're the listeners to the sermons. And John is telling us we are on trial too. What will we do with this man? We like to think, of course, that we would be different, of course. But John is warning us, religious people can know all the facts, attend all the services and ceremonies, and still miss the Messiah. Church folks, church kids, church parents, be careful. That's what John is saying. The crowds can be swayed to choose wisely or foolishly. Those still undecided, which way will you go? This is why he wrote the book. Remember, it's in the next chapter, but we've been looking at it over and over again. These things are written so that you in the audience may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So as we look at this scene today in front of Pilate, the second part of this, we've talked about how John is like a stage director as he tells us the story through a cast of characters. They've come out on the stage now for 19 chapters and told us things about Jesus and about ourselves. We mentioned this last week. John the Baptizer comes out from behind the curtain at the beginning of the story and shouts out, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." Then the very first disciples who listened to John in chapter 1 invite us into the story. They say, "Come and see. Come and check out this person like we're doing." Nicodemus, who is actually one of the Pharisees, comes out from behind the curtain and says, "Surely this man must come from God, because no one can do these signs unless God be with him." He's a very pious Jewish leader, but he sees that he must be from God. He shouts it out to the audience. Think about that. The very next chapter is somebody who's actually so opposite of Nicodemus. He's a man. She's a woman. He's pious. She's shady. She's the woman at the well. And she says, "Come and see a man who told me everything I've ever done." This is drama. And John is doing what a great writer does. He is speaking through his characters to us, the readers and listeners. And he's inviting us, come and see this man. Check him out. So we've been checking him out for 19 chapters now. And now Pilate is holding court on him. John, the stage director, is going to let us listen in as Pilate shouts out some things about Jesus also. In this passage that Charles read for us, there are 3 loud commands that Pilate makes. Did you hear them? He's yelling something to the Jewish leaders and to the crowds out there, but he's especially yelling them to us. in the audience. These three commands all begin with the same word. They're meant to catch our attention. They tell us about the motives and the hearts of Pilate, of the religious leaders, and of the crowd, all at once. John uses these words to especially expose our hearts as well. Where do we stand? Each of these three phrases that Pilate yells begin with the word behold, or in some versions, look or see. Open your eyes. Some of our versions, including the ESV, which I'm using, say see once and behold twice, so it can be a little confusing. Each of these phrases begin, though, with the word behold or look or see. In the Greek, the word is a little tiny three-letter word called ide, and it means behold or look. And it shows up like three blinking lights in this story as Pilate yells it out. Behold, look, see. It's a command that's meant to get our attention. The word is like a whistle that a referee blows that stops all the action. The whistle blows, everyone stops what they're doing and looks to the referee to see what he or she is calling. And the referee is saying, behold, a foul has occurred. There's a penalty on this team or that team. That's what this word means. Stop, look, and listen. The first use of this word is in verse 4, chapter 19, as Charles read, where he says, see or behold, I am bringing him out to you, so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. That's the first one. The second one is in the very next verse. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said, behold, look, see him, see the man. And then in verse 14, we see the third loud cry from Pilate. Now it was the day of the Passover, of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He, Pilate, said to them, behold, your king. These are the three commands of Pilate to get our attention. They're meant to stop us in our tracks, as we said. Pilate is pointing to the man on trial, Jesus of Nazareth. Behold him. So here's the big idea today. Stop and look carefully at Jesus. Is he the sinless one? The one who suffers for us? Is he the one who is worthy to be king of your life? That is what this passage is asking us. Now that we've looked at him for 19 chapters, is he the sinless one? Is he the one who can suffer for us? And is he worth our time to make him our king? That's what this is about. So let's look at the first of these phrases. Behold, see, he is innocent. Verse 4, he says again, behold, I am bringing him out to you, so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. 3 times in this story, the very end of chapter 18 and verse 38, And here in verse 4 and verse 6, Pilate says 3 other things, but they're all the same thing. 3 times he says, I find no guilt in him. He has quizzed Jesus. Last week in chapter 18, we saw 6 questions that Pilate asked as he interrogates Jesus. But this prisoner does not sound like he's a revolutionary. He's been turned over to him because he is supposedly trying to overthrow the Roman Empire. He's trying to make himself a king, they tell him. Luke tells us that the religious leaders accused him of misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ the King. Think about what they accused him of. It's certainly not true that he forbade them paying taxes to Caesar. We have it clearly in almost all in the synoptics, in the synoptic gospels, that he clearly said to his disciples and to a group of Pharisees, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. He doesn't forbid giving to Caesar. He tells them to do that. That's a false claim. And when Pilate asked him, are you the Christ, a king? Are you trying to set yourself up as a king? He says simply, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would be fighting. But my kingdom is not of this world. Pilate is stunned. These are not the words of a revolutionary who's trying to overthrow Rome. Pilate has asked numerous questions. Matthew and Mark tell us other things, such as when they both say Pilate knew that the Jewish leaders were envious of Jesus. Jesus has the crowds following him, and they didn't anymore. Pilate is convinced that Jesus is innocent. He's not vindictive. He's calm, and he's in control. This is not a revolutionary. But while Pilate is convinced of Jesus' innocence, we see another side to Pilate here that shows us that Pilate himself is not innocent. Not by a far cry. This passage shows us insights into Pilate's character, or lack of character, we might say. Pilate, if you look in this story, you see that he is convinced of Jesus' innocence. But the next thing we see is that he is a coward. Several things in the text reveal to us that this man who looks so strong and mighty, in charge of all of this, is not really in charge. He is a fearful, weak coward. He is, first of all, afraid, we're told. In verse 8, it tells us that when the Jews say, this man made himself out to be the Son of God, notice their emphasis. He made himself to be the Son of God. He's making this up, Pilate. But when Pilate hears that, it says he is more afraid. This tells us that he was already afraid, but it's ramped up now. The Romans and the Greeks had all kinds of gods that they worshiped. And the emperor was supposedly a god on earth, like Pharaoh thought himself to be. And so when Pilate hears this, that this man is making himself a god, he realizes, uh-oh, not only is this guy innocent, but I don't know what I'm messing with here. He might be some kind of supernatural being, and he gets more fearful. He's afraid. Most cowards start with fear. The other thing that we get insight into from Matthew on why he's fearful is because his wife has contacted him, sending him a text on his phone, I guess, and it says, "Have nothing to do with this righteous man. I have had a strange dream." Notice she calls him this righteous man. He's innocent. Leave him alone. Don't make a foolish mistake. But Pilate is caught in the middle. He is really afraid now. Thank you, dear, for that encouragement to me this morning. You've helped me so much. Now I'm more afraid than ever. But along with his fear, we see that Pilate is a people pleaser. This is part of him being a coward. One of the humorous things, or we might say very sad things, is, as we said earlier, Pilate, the man who seems to be powerful and in control, is running back and forth trying to please everyone. Now just listen to this for a minute. I'm going to run down through some verses and show you him running back and forth like a scared chicken. In chapter 18, verse 28, when the Jews won't come into the governor's headquarters, we talked about this last week, their hypocrisy. If they go into the governor's headquarters, he's a Gentile, and then they won't be able to participate in Passover. They're worried about the external rules of religion. They're not worried about the fact that their hearts are filled with murder and anger and bitterness, and we're going to get this guy. But they don't want to be unclean by going into a Gentile's house, so they stay outside. But that makes Pilate, the people pleaser, decide to be extra friendly. It says in verse 29, since they don't come in, Pilate goes outside to them. And that's nice enough. But then listen to this. In verse 33, it says he goes back inside to talk to Jesus. Then in verse 38, he goes back outside to talk to the Jews. In 19:1, he goes back inside to Jesus. Then he comes back out to the Jews and the crowd with Jesus. Then he goes back inside in verses 9 to 11 to speak to Jesus privately. Then he comes back outside with Jesus again in verse 13. And then he finally yields to the Jews and gives Jesus up to be crucified in verse 16. In and out, in and out, in and out. That's not because he's friendly. It's because he's a people pleaser. And he's in the middle of the Jewish authorities and the Roman government that he represents, and these people that are screaming from the crowd. And he's trying to please them all. 8 times he runs back and forth between the parties. The Synoptic Gospels give us a little more insight into this. Mark 15 says, Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, releases Barabbas to them. Matthew tells us, their voices prevailed, so Pilate decided that their demands should be granted. Not because it's just or the right ruling, but their voices prevailed, so their demands must be granted. But here's where it gets worse. Pilate's cowardice is only overshadowed by his cruelty. Pilate is cruel. Look at chapter 19, where Charles began this morning, and verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. Now keep in mind, this is right in the midst of his 3 declarations that he believes Jesus is innocent. But this chapter begins by saying Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. Flogging is taking the cat of 9 tails, the leather whips, and bringing them down on a prisoner's back 39 times, because 40 is the limit. And so they did it 39 times to make sure they didn't go over the limit. But in the midst of saying, this man is innocent, I find no guilt in him, 3 times, I will flog him. Why? Because he is a coward and because he is cruel. Incidentally, this is the first of 2 floggings that Jesus will receive. The Romans actually had 3 levels of floggings for criminals with 3 different words used. John's word here and the timing of it is the first kind of flogging. Here's what one commentator says. The first flogging is a lighter flogging that is painful but not debilitating. People who committed minor crimes were whipped. There was a second level that was more severe, and a third level that was the most severe of all, but that type of scourging was not used until the prisoner was sentenced to be executed. Matthew and Mark both describe that third fierce flogging that occurs right before the crucifixion. We'll talk more about that next week. But that's why Jesus falls under bearing his cross as he goes through the city in the Via Dolorosa. This flogging is a first degree flogging, which is not as debilitating as the final one, but it's bad enough, 39 whips. Notice also that verses 2 and 3 describe how the soldiers twist together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and then array him in a purple robe, which was a sign of royalty. It was most likely one of the Roman soldiers' garments that were red that may have faded somewhat and made it look a little purple. We don't know. But the idea was to mock him because he claims to be a king. Most commentators believe that these thorns were from date palms, and their thorns extend to about 12 inches in length. Can you imagine? In a few weeks, when we do the Good Friday service, I just ordered a crown of thorns from Amazon. Isn't that great? You can just get anything you want at Amazon. And we're going to put it here on the table to remind us of that. But those thorns aren't 12 inches long. They're just little presentable thorns. But these thorns were huge if they were date palm thorns. And they were crushed down on his scalp, which would lead to incredibly sharp pain and instant blood gushing down his face. And then the soldiers come up to him and begin to mock. Hail, which is what you said to Caesar, the Almighty King. Hail, King of the Jews. And they struck him with their hands, it says. The tense of the verb is they continued striking him with their hands. So they're punching him and slapping him back and forth for some length of time. We don't know. And then in verse 4 is when we see Pilate's first command. Behold, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. Well, if that's the case, Pilate, why did you flog him? Luke also tells us that Pilate says this 3 times. He's innocent. I find no guilt in him. But then Luke quotes Pilate saying, I will punish and release him. Why, Pilate? To please the people. He's caught in the middle. If I give him a good whipping, the Jewish leaders hopefully will be happy enough that I punished him, and the crowd will get a kick out of it and then agree, that's enough. Let the poor man go. But it's not enough. This leads to Pilate's second command. In verse 5, he shouts, "Behold the man." Not only is Pilate convinced of his innocence, and this people-pleasing coward, and absolutely cruel, but here we see he is conniving. Pilate is working the system as best he can. He's trying to play both sides of the table. The idea of behold the man is one of pity. Here comes this man who's supposed to be a king, who's going to overthrow Caesar, and he's dripping with blood. He's in this faded robe, and he's been beaten 39 times. He looks pitiful. And the idea of look at this man is more the idea of look at this poor wretch. Have you had enough? Let's have some mercy on him. Look at him. He's battered and bruised. He's bleeding profusely. Let's let him be. He's hoping that the Jewish authorities will show some mercy and say, okay, hopefully he's learned his lesson. That's enough for now. And surely the crowd will have some mercy. Pilate, John is telling us in the audience, represents those of us who flit back and forth about Jesus. Those who look here and there, trying to figure out who he is. Americans, millennials, boomers, all of us have our times of looking at Jesus. We all know about him, and we all have opinions back and forth. He was a really good man. It was really terrible what happened to him. And he really says some good things in the Gospels. Like Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers, says, he was a wonderful teacher, but he cut out the miracles literally in his Bible. We don't go for all that stuff, but he really said some wise, helpful things for people. Son of God, that's a little extreme. Someone I staked my whole life on, I don't know about that. I'll give him his due. I'll look at the man. But I don't think I can go that far to make him my king. One other point before we go on is these soldiers, Pilate, don't even realize that they are fulfilling the prophecies that have been proclaimed for 700 years. Pilate is not in control. Wickedness is prevailing, but it is all under the sovereignty of God, who has declared that his son will end up on a cross. But before he gets there, Isaiah prophesied, I gave my back to those who strike, and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting. A couple chapters later, Isaiah says, as many were astonished at you. His appearance was so marred, behold, beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, as one from whom men hid their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. That's what Isaiah is saying 700 years earlier, that comes out in Pilate's words, "Behold this poor wretch. Look at this man." What a pity. And yet, it's the will of God. He was wounded for our transgressions, Isaiah will go on to say. The cross is his throne as a king. It's interesting, this word, just a little side note here. The term for behold the man. In Latin, the phrase is ecce homo. Behold, look at the man. Our missionary in Romania, Donnie, his church is connected with a ministry there called Ecce Homo. And a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to him, and we were talking about our ministry in Romania, and he mentioned that we can minister along with Ecce Homo. And I had been looking at this, and I said, Donnie, I've heard you talk about that ministry all this time, but is that the same phrase that's in John 19? And he said, we're talking on WhatsApp, a Zoom call, and he looks at me like, don't you know anything, preacher? And he goes, of course, Tim. Ecce homo, look at the man. And I said, well, how did it get that name? And he said, because they do great works in our city, and they want people to look at the man. And I said, wow, thank you. I'd never put that together. Look at the man. Stop. Check him out. Is he worthy of being not just a man, but our king? That goes into the final claim from Pilate, is behold your king. Now this really gets interesting here when we get to this part of the story. He says it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And what happened at the 6th hour was, through a strange irony, or the strange sovereignty of God, the 6th hour on the day of preparation, on Friday before the Sabbath, was the hour that the lambs were slain for Passover. And right at this time, when the lambs were being slain, this Lamb of God was being led to the cross. But before he goes, Pilate cries out to the crowd, in his own mockery apparently, or who knows what is on his mind, but he points to this beaten poor wretch and says, behold your king. You bunch of Jewish people. He's full of anti-Semitism, along with all of his other issues. He's your king. Behold him. Take a good look at it. Remember what I said about John being like a stage director here. All the biblical writers are like this. They are painting a picture for us, not just dictating words to us. But John is painting a theme for us through this chapter especially. It's the theme of kingship. 12 times in this little conversation between Jesus and Pilate, the name king or kingdom comes up. Pilate asks him when he first meets him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus goes on to say, "You say that I'm a king. Who told you that? The Jewish people or someone else?" Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my leaders would be fighting, but my kingdom is not of this world." Pilate says, "So you are a king." And it goes back and forth. 12 times through here, this theme keeps ringing from John. Is he the king? Is he really the king? Or is he making himself a king, like the Jews say? Is he trying to overthrow Caesar? Or is his kingdom not of this world? Is it something different? And he's talking to us as the audience after 19 chapters. Is he a really good man? Or is he the king? Is he worthy of being the king of your life? This kingship theme is a all the way through the Bible term. That's not good grammar, but I'm trying to say it's a theme that starts right from the beginning. Adam and Eve are king and queen in the garden until they sin, and they're chased out of the garden. But God, in his mercy, says, "I am going to bring a king. The seed of the woman is going to have his heel bruised, but he's going to crush the serpent." As we go through the book of Genesis, he tells Abraham, "I am going to bless your seed. I'm going to bless the world through your seed." And then we go a little bit further into the book, and Jacob, as an old man in chapter 49 of Genesis, right before Genesis closes, Jacob makes a prophecy for all of his sons. And he says something very strange to Judah. The scepter that the king holds shall not depart from Judah. He's going to come from Judah's line, the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of all the peoples. There's a king coming, Judah, and it's going to come through you. A little bit later in the book of 1 Samuel, we find that the people under Samuel decide, we want a king like all the other nations. And Samuel says, you don't need a king. God is our king. But they say, we want a king. Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel praised the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. So God, in his sovereignty, but also in his kindness to his stubborn, disobedient people like us, says, you know what? I am going to give you a king, and he's going to be a great king. And in the book of 2 Samuel, we read God's promise to David. Not only is it going to come through the line of Judah, but it's going to come through the family of David. And God tells David, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. As you go through the prophets, we read that the king is coming, and they're waiting for him. When is he going to get here? What's he going to look like? What's he going to do? We know he's coming from Judah. We know he's coming from the line of David. But who's he going to be? And all the kings through the rest of the Old Testament are terrible representatives of a godly king, with a few exceptions. But then we get to Matthew, and the genealogy that we're so bored with when we open up the New Testament zeroes down on this little baby that is born from a virgin who just happens to be from Judah, just happens to be from the line of David. And this little baby grows up as a common carpenter, but now, for 3 years, he's been doing kingly things, speaking like a king, saying, will you follow me? Will you give your life to me? Those who chase their own life will lose it, but those who follow me will gain it. It may cost you a cross, but follow me. And when we get to this part of the story, we see something very strange. The Jewish people who hate the Roman government, who hate Caesar, but they're under his thumb, they have one last thing to throw at Pilate, because Pilate is about to cave in. Look at this man, he's pitiful. Haven't you had enough? And they hollered at Pilate and say, in verse 12, Pilate from then on sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Being a friend of Caesar was a political title for his best men. And Pilate wanted to be on that list. He wanted to stay on the list if he was Caesar's friend. But they say, if you release him, you people pleaser, you will not please Caesar. Everyone who makes himself a king, like this Jesus guy is doing, opposes Caesar. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at the place called the Stone Pavement, in Aramaic Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, behold your king. They cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, this is the biggest irony in all of Scripture. We have no king but Caesar. Just like the children of Israel, God is saying, it's okay, Samuel. They are not rejecting you, they are rejecting me. And here is the second fulfillment of that, where they reject God in the flesh as their king. We have no king but Caesar. This is the biggest irony and the biggest tyranny imaginable, that Jewish people would say the Roman king is our guy instead of this wretch. So he delivered him over to be crucified. This story is about these people, but it is also about us. When we talk about kingship, we as Americans know nothing about that. Our whole system was built on anti-king. We're independent. We are our own boss. And we do that not only politically, but we do that in our heart as well. The book of John is the gospel of belief. He who believes in me. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but will have everlasting life. Well, a lot of us interpret that of, yeah, I believe in him. I've been a church kid all my life. I said a little prayer to get myself into heaven. I got my ticket. I'm okay. I'm just waiting. But belief in John is also deciding, am I going to let him be my king? Stop and look carefully at Jesus. Is he the sinless one? I find no guilt in him. Is he the one who can suffer for us? And Paul tells us later, he who knew no sin became sin for us, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. He is the one who can suffer for us. But is he the one worthy to be the king of our lives? Let me just close with this quote from Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. This is what kingship looks like. He says, imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps you can understand what he's doing. He's getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. You knew that those jobs needed doing, and so you're not surprised. But presently, he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and does not seem to make any sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he is building quite a different house from the one you thought of. Throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage. But he is building a palace. He intends to come and live in it himself. That's what it means to give your life to him. But he doesn't shrink your life. He makes it a palace, and he lives in it. He's worthy to be the king. It's a good deal. He's not going to make you miserable. He may take you through terrible suffering while he's rebuilding the house. But he's worthy of it, because he knows what he's doing with our lives. John is crying out to us saying, are you going to be like Pilate caught in the middle? Are you going to be like the crowds that can be swayed either way? Are you going to be like the Jewish religious leaders who have ignored all the scriptures that they've memorized, but their heart is not in it? They're just church people? Or are you going to say, he is my king? After 19 chapters, that's what John is asking us. Let's pray.